Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. The wind whispered through the rice paddies of rural Vietnam, carrying the scent of Tet's lanterns and the hum of a market stirring to life. Tieu Diep knelt in her yard, her hands scattering grain for her chickens. Hockey's loyal bounds a faint comfort to a heart shocked by a secret she couldn't voice. The phone in her pocket, James's gift, was a fragile thread to dreams, to learn to rise, to become more than the orphan girl who'd fought a broken past. But now it felt like a weight, its silence a mirror to a soul trembling with doubt. Kien's words from days ago lingered sharp as thorns. Stay away from James. His company's a mess. Her heart wavered, torn by the man she loved and a rumor that pulsed like a storm, while across the fields, a man fought to save a company, and a love, under siege by whispers of failure. Diep's shack was a sanctuary, its patched walls warm with the scars of survival, its yard alive with Hockey's warmth and the soft cluck of chickens. She'd built this life from ashes, orphaned young, betrayed by an uncle who'd stolen her inheritance, married at 16 to a man whose fists carved wounds deeper than skin. She'd fled, her name her only guide, and found James, his truck stuck in mud, her shy laughter weaving with his as they freed it. "You're enough," he'd said, his voice steady, his eyes seeing her not as broken but as whole. She'd believed him, her heart blooming for a man who called her scars stars, who gave her a phone to touch a world she'd feared, letters she'd forgotten, a screen she fumbled. She tried, her tears falling in the quiet of night, her love for him a flame that burned but trembled. Now as she prepared for the day, Hockey at her side, she thought of James, of his laughter, of a company shadowed by rumors, and of Kien's warning, a cloud that darkened her dawn. She greeted the dawn with a smile for her viewers, her voice bright as she spoke to the camera, a ritual for her YouTube channel. "Hello everyone," she'd said, her hands busy with feed. "I hope you're having a good time watching. Eat, eat, eat." She turned to Hockey, her loyal companion, and patted his head. "Look after the house for me, okay? I'm off to work. Be good." Hockey's tail wagged, his eyes warm and Diep's heart lifted, her love for him a spark that glowed. But as she grabbed her bag, her thoughts turned to James. He'd promised to call, to meet her today, but the phone stayed silent. Is he working like he said? She wondered, her fingers tracing the screen, a flicker of doubt creeping in. She pushed it away, her resolve a vow, and stepped into the morning, her heart shocked by a silence she couldn't name. James arrived soon after, his truck rumbling through the dust, his smile warm but his eyes sharp. "I'm taking you to the commune," he'd said, his voice steady. "You're harvesting today, right? I've got a meeting in the city, so it's on the way." Diep had nodded, her heart racing, but her smile faltered. He'd noticed, his brow furrowing. "Why do you look so sad?" he'd asked, his voice soft, but Diep had shaken her head, her words trapped. "It's nothing," she'd said, hiding Kien's warning, fearing it would break the fragile thread between them. James had frowned, his eyes searching hers. "Your uncle said something, didn't he?" he'd guessed, his voice low, but Diep had stayed silent, her heart shocked by a truth she couldn't face. They'd driven on, the fields a blur, and James had stopped by the road, his hand lingering on hers. "I'm busy today," he'd said, "but I'll see you later." Diep had nodded, her heart heavy, and stepped out, her step slow as she watched him drive away, her love a flame that flickered under the weight of rumors unspoken. In the fields, James met Tieu, his friend and partner in a new rice venture. The paddies stretched wide, their green a promise of harvest, and Tieu knelt, his hands tracing the stalks. "This new rice variety strong," he'd said, his voice bright. "Healthy, green, even. Better than the old ones." James had nodded, his heart lifting, his resolve a spark. "It's high yield," he'd said, "but the difference shows in 2 weeks. You'll see." Tieu had smiled, his eyes sharp, and agreed to arrange a container truck for the seeds. "The farmers need this," he'd said, and James had nodded, his thoughts on the fields, on the families who depended on them, on a company fighting to rise. But Tieu's voice had softened, his words heavy. "How's Diep?" he'd asked, and James had paused, his heart racing. "We're fine," he'd said, "just some problems lately." Tieu had nodded, his eyes distant. "I liked her once, you know," he'd said, his voice low. "But you're my friend, so I stepped back. Make her happy, James. Marry her soon, or you'll lose her. The villagers talk, she's got no parents, and they're harsh." James had faltered, his heart shocked, but his resolve held. "I'll propose," he'd said, "once the company's stable." Tieu had nodded, his eyes sharp, and James had left, his heart heavy, his love a vow that trembled under the weight of time. Diep, meanwhile, stood in the market, her voice bright as she called to passers-by. "Buy coffee, sister," she'd said, her hands arranging the beans. "They're sent to him to Tet's promise." She'd harvested that morning, her back aching, her heart set on selling out. Each sale was a step, a spark of hope for a life beyond the fields, and she'd smiled, her resolve aflame. But her thoughts turned to Qian, to his warning, to the rumors that shadowed James. She'd left the market early, her earnings light, and walked to Qian's house, her heart racing, her steps firm. "Why do you keep stopping me from being with James?" she'd asked, her voice trembling, her eyes sharp. Qian had sighed, his face lined with worry. "I heard things," he'd said, his voice low. "Workers at his house demanding pay. His company's in trouble, Diep. I'm scared he's not good for you." Diep had faltered, her heart shocked, but her faith held. "He's good," she'd said, her voice steady. "The villagers say his company's growing now. Tell me straight, don't hide things." Qian had nodded, his eyes soft. "I just worry," he'd said. "You're like family with no parents to guide you." Diep had softened, her heart easing, and handed him her earnings. "For food," she'd said, her voice warm, "and rice. Thank you for caring." Qian had smiled, his eyes bright, and Diep had left, her heart shocked but warmed, her kindness a spark that glowed. Back at her shack, Diep knelt by Hockey, her hands patting his fur. "You were good today," she'd said, her voice soft, staying home, watching the house. Hockey's tail wagged, his warmth a balm, and Diep's heart lifted, her love for him aflame. She turned to the kitchen, her hands busy with glutinous rice flour, shaping dough into donuts, their bean paste filling a gift for James. "I hope he likes these," she'd said, her voice shy, her resolve a spark. But the phone stayed silent, her calls to James unanswered, and doubt crept in. "Is it broken?" she'd wondered, her fingers trembling, her heart shocked by a silence that stung. She pushed it away, her hand steady, and fried the donuts, their scent a promise, her love a vow that held. James arrived at dusk, his truck rattling through the fields, a bag of apples in his hand. "They were selling these in the city," he'd said, his smile warm, big, sweet ones. Diep had smiled, her heart racing, and offered him a donut, its crust crisp, its filling soft. "I made these," she'd said, her voice shy, "but they're not perfect." James had bitten in, his eyes bright. "They're great," he'd said, crisp outside, sweet inside. "What flour is this?" Diep had laughed, her heart easing. "Glutinous rice," she'd said, "mixed with water, shaped like this." They'd eaten, the apples sweet, the donuts warm, and James's voice had softened, his eyes steady. "You're the girl I've been looking for," he'd said, his voice low. "Good, honest, hardworking. You've risen from nothing, Diep, and I love that." Diep had blushed, her heart shocked, her love aflame. "Our backgrounds are different," he'd said, "but that doesn't matter. It's our hearts, our feelings. Society's harsh, rich, poor, they judge, but we'll prove them wrong." He'd smiled, his hand on hers, and compared her to the donut. "From raw flour, fit for pigs, to this," he'd said, "through fire, through work. You're like that, Diep, shining through pain." Diep had smiled, her tears hidden, her love a hymn that held her still. But as they ate, Diep's smile faded, her hand trembling. The scent of the donuts, sharp with oil, hit her, and her chest tightened, her vision blurring. "I'm not okay," she'd said, her voice weak, and James's eyes widened, his heart racing. "What's wrong?" he'd asked, his voice sharp, and Diep had swayed, her breath short. "The smell," she'd said, "it's too much." James had caught her, his arm steady, and helped her inside, his voice urgent. "Lie down," he'd said, and called Tuan, his voice sharp. "Get a doctor to Diep's house, now." Diep had lain on her mat, her chest tight, her heart shocked, and James had knelt beside her, his hand on hers. "You're okay," he'd said, his voice soft, but Diep's fear pulsed, a secret she couldn't voice. The doctor arrived, his bag heavy, his eyes calm. "What's wrong?" he'd asked, and Diep had whispered, her voice weak. "Dizzy, nauseous, chest tight." He checked her pulse, his hand steady, and frowned. "I suspect you're pregnant," he'd said, his voice low, and Diep's heart stopped, her world tilting. "Pregnant?" she'd asked, her voice a thread, and the doctor had nodded. "It's likely with these symptoms. Test in a week to confirm." Diep had faltered, her heart shocked, and clutched his arm. "Keep it secret," she'd said, her voice sharp, and the doctor had nodded, his eyes soft. "I won't tell," he'd said, and left, his steps quiet. To James he'd said only, "She's exhausted. Rest, good food, she'll recover." James had nodded, his heart easing, and turned to Diep, his smile warm. "You scared me," he'd said, his voice light, and teased her, his laughter soft. "Don't joke like that again." Diep had smiled, her tears hidden, her secret a weight that pulsed like a wound. James had stayed, his hand on hers, his voice steady. "Give me time," he'd said, "to stabilize the company. Then I'll come for you, I promise. Diep had nodded, her heart shocked, her love a vow that trembled. He'd left at dusk, his truck fading into the fields, his promise a spark, and Diep had stood, her hands trembling, her secret a shadow that loomed. The lanterns glowed across the fields, Tet's promise a faint light, and Diep thought of James, of his laughter, of a company shadowed by rumors, of a child she might carry. Her heart raced, her love a flame that burned, her fear a whisper that lingered. She thought of hockey, of the coffee she'd sold, of the donuts she'd made, and of the farmers, their fields dry, their hope tied to James's dreams. Would his company rise or fall under the weight of whispers? Would her love, shocked by a secret she hid, endure, or break under a truth she couldn't face? Diep sat by her door, hockey at her side, the night deep and still. She touched her stomach, her fingers trembling, and whispered to the stars, her voice of prayer. "What comes next?" she asked, her heart shocked, her love a vow that held her steady, a flame that flickered but refused to die.